Okay, folks, you're all very welcome to the first of our workshops. Amanda Kracen is going to talk to us about coping with the fear of recurrence. So we'll just give a moment there, and let's give an introduction then to Amanda. Amanda, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
There we go. So I guess we just hit good afternoon. So good afternoon. As Eddie said, my name is Amanda Kracen. I'm a psychologist, and I'm really happy to be here, and I'm appreciative to the Irish Cancer Society for having me here, and thank you for being here. I think it makes a difference about building community, and as we've heard about coming together, we can do that online, but there's also something really wonderful about doing it in person, and these connections that are being made up here, in the hallways, in the toilets, at lunch, they make a difference. And so I'm grateful that you're here, and I'm glad to be joining you. As I said, I'm a psychologist. I've worked in cancer care for my entire career, pretty much, so for about the last 20 years, and have had the privilege of working with cancer survivors, both in the US and in Ireland. So as you can hear, I'm originally from Chicago, but have been living back and forth between the US and here for about the last 25, 26 years. So I'm glad to be here right now. With everything that's going on in the States, particularly glad to be here, even fine with the rain today. So I'm gonna jump in, and this is about coping with fear of cancer recurrence. And I would just encourage you to take a moment and just think about what would you like to get out of our time together. It's brief today, but and think about ahead. Are there questions you'd like to ask or things that you really want to attend to? Because I want to make sure that this is meaningful for everybody in this room. I think the bottom line, just to get to the punchline here, a lot of times we hear this, am I crazy? And so just to reassure, any of the thoughts or feelings or experiences or emotions you're having, you're not crazy. Just to also reiterate, there is help and support, there's treatment, and that you don't have to do this alone. Again, that idea of community and coming together is so incredibly important. So I just want to start with a quote. I don't know if anybody else has read this. It's a more recent book, but this is by Suleika Jawad, and she's a cancer survivor with leukemia, unfortunately, with a recent recurrence, and is currently going through that. Just had her second bone marrow transplant, but she's a writer, an artist, an advocate, and has been writing for years. But recently, just earlier this year, I believe, published a book called Between Two Kingdoms. And there's some really profound things that she writes about in there that are profound and individual, but also incredibly universal. And she says, to learn to swim in the ocean of not knowing, this is my constant work. And I think that idea that I hear so often from people, I don't know, I'm uncertain, I don't know what's ahead. And in psychology, we actually know that uncertainty and ambiguity are incredibly distressing, and those get ratcheted up with a cancer diagnosis and into survivorship. And that she talks about, this is her work to do, is how to live, how to continue on, how to have a life with the uncertainty. So, and I think we're going to have questions at the end, so please jot things down. If there's things you'd like to talk about or learn further about, or comments or feedback for me, I welcome all of that. So just briefly, you've probably heard of the concept of cancer recurrence, fear of cancer recurrence. In the research literature, it's defined as the fear, worry, or concern relating to the possibility that cancer will come back or progress, right? That's very clear. And probably everybody could use language in their own lives about what that means to them. Interestingly enough, I think what people are not aware of, both in the healthcare professions and survivors themselves and families, after treatment, managing this fear of recurrence is the #1 unmet need of cancer survivors. A lot of times, I was just talking with somebody, Mary here, who I met earlier today, and she was just talking about the changes that happen years later after a diagnosis. And there's this, she was sharing, and this is it resonated because I've heard it so often about kind of encouragement from others of just get on, move on with it. You're cured or things are better, keep on going. And yet without a recognition that sometimes things have shifted or changed, or if there's survivorship issues that have to be managed. And so one of these things that a lot of people is not aware of is just how do we manage fear of cancer recurrence? And sadly, it's incredibly common, and not just a little thing. We see that people are managing moderate to severe worry around this. And interestingly enough, carers, loved ones, caregivers, family members also are kind of walking along carrying these fears as well. In some studies, they've actually been shown to be kind of consistent with survivors, and other studies even higher rates among family members and loved ones. Just some of the things from the literature, what are some of these risk factors? We tend to see higher rates. And again, everybody's individual and different. So, take this for what it's worth. This is looking at big numbers of people and kind of some of the trends that we see in the research. But younger people, women, if there's already been emotional issues or mental health issues at baseline, so if somebody, anxiety unfortunately is common, we see mood disorders, depression. If somebody's coming into a cancer experience with that, they may also, a cancer diagnosis may exacerbate or make things worse in terms of fear of recurrence. And then there's also different aspects. It can be affected by the type of cancer, the type of treatment, whether somebody has physical symptoms. So there's a lot of things that can kind of contribute to people's fear of cancer recurrence. And unfortunately, what I think we really need to pay attention to is this doesn't just go away. For many people, it doesn't just get better on its own. So what we found in the research, and I really appreciated earlier in the talk, of hearing, or the conference today is hearing about what a difference research can make. These are some of the areas that fear of cancer recurrence is well known, but it's under-researched. So we have some indication, but it would really help. We need more research to understand how can we do a better job of helping people manage this persistent worry. Because what the early research is really showing is it can continue for a long time. And I always go back to the idea of distress and suffering. If somebody is struggling or suffering, we need to pay attention. And so for a person, this can be distress. This can be worry, this can be disrupted sleep, this can be rumination, kind of that repetitive thinking about something. It can be poor functioning. So for people, they may not attend a medical appointment. They may be so distracted or overwhelmed, they may not take their medications as prescribed. So there's lots of outcomes of this, and just in general, lower quality of life. My guess is nobody's going to raise their hand and say they enjoy being anxious and worried. Typically that's not something people, it's not an enjoyable aspect of anxiety or worry in general. So we see in general just a huge impact that fear of recurrence takes on people. And for society, this is something we want to invest in and understand even more and pay attention to, because we do see higher healthcare usage. With people who are anxious or worried, they're more likely to seek additional reassurance from healthcare providers. They're more likely to present to a hospital. They're more likely to use resources. Now, again, we should use resources we want to or as we need to, but ideally, we're providing earlier treatment. And that's why hearing about some of the interventions that are being done with survivorship treatment and survivorship plans is so incredibly important, because we know early intervention makes a difference. And so we can help improve people's well-being. So just kind of some of what the research would describe. But I'd just be curious, and you don't have to share, but just for you in your own head, if this is something that you are aware of or you experience. And again, it's pretty typical. But how would you describe that? How would you, what language would you put to it? I've had patients in the past talk about it as a big, dark, smelly dog, right? I've had patients talk about the, what it does to their sleep and their agitation and their relationships with their children. And so I think it's individual for each person. And so I think it can be useful because one of the things we know from the research is to even put some control to to not let this be an ambiguous, overwhelming, kind of disabling experience, is to acknowledge it and put language to it. So what does it mean in our own lives? What does it mean? How does it look like for us? So just to go back with another quote from Zuleika Jawad, when the body betrays you again and again, it obliterates whatever nascent trust you've restored in the universe and your place in it. Each time it becomes harder to recover your sense of safety. And after you've had the ceiling cave in on you, whether through illness or some other catastrophe, you don't assume structural stability. And this is my bold, but you must learn to live on the fault lines. And I really think that's a powerful quote because one of the things I like about it is it's true. Ideally, we're learning to live. Even today, the theme of this conference is living well. And this is possible. And live with, and we've heard already from some survivors this morning, Sonia and Paul, about building a life with meaning and with purpose and joy and family. But it is also learning how to live when there's been a disruption. And that takes energy and effort. This was a paper, a conceptual paper that we published several years ago, myself and some of my wonderful colleagues. And we looked at, and I think it was earlier, maybe Paul talked about resilience a little bit, and this ability to bounce back is a simple kind of way of thinking about resilience. I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but we bring who we are before a cancer diagnosis, we bring all of those attributes into a diagnosis. Then we have cancer-related events, and this could be a diagnosis, it could be a scan, it could be an appointment, it could, whatever it is. Then we have a personal reaction and a coping response, and we kind of have this continuum of resilience and distress, right? And fear of cancer recurrence really puts us in the area of distress. And we really want to help people and support people not to have to stay there. Sometimes we'll go there, but what we don't want is for people to stay there and be stuck there. And so there's an intervention. An intervention kind of puts people back, and hopefully an intervention can move people more towards resilience. So kind of the natural question is, what are some of these interventions? And the good news is there's lots of interventions. So, and that's kind of what I want to move into and talk about then is, what are some of these interventions? A lot of this is around coping. And there's a wide variety. I'm going to talk about some of these, and my hope is just even to help you think about broadening kind of some of the coping you already do. But in general, notice that word control. All of these coping strategies are about helping take back some of the control. Control in general, there was a study done years ago, and I love this study, but it was essentially it was looking at people who were in a hospital, and it pretty much, they had kind of two conditions. One condition, it was just a normal hospital room. The other condition, they gave them a hospital room that had all these different aspects where they had more control. So some of those things were, they had furniture that they could move around if they wanted the table here or the table here. They had control over how hot or cold the room was. They had control over what art they could put in the room. They had control over, how easily it was to open the windows. It's amazing. That research has been replicated over and over again, that when we give people a sense of control and we look for the areas where we can have control, we have higher quality of life. We tend to have better health outcomes. And there's actually research that's showing that we can impact how long somebody actually lives. So I cannot stress enough that sense. The reality is we actually have very little control over, many things. But even as Paul talked about, right? When he was hospitalized and he found ways to walk the floors. Like he was able to assert himself and take some control over how he spent his time. And that's really, really important. So looking for those places where we can seek some sort of control. Now there's not a single, if I could tell you here are the top 3 things to do, that would be great and we could improve everybody's quality of life. The good thing is, it really varies based on the person. And so there's going to be things that speak to you and things that speak to the person next to you. And that's true for all of us, right? How we cope varies individually. So it's really about needing to find the menu that works well, right? So even if we went out for breakfast, somebody else is going to order a different thing than I'm going to order, and yet we're all going to have a good breakfast. And so I often think about that as it's really about finding a menu of options of what works for you. And it's going to look different. There we go. I don't know if Orla Crow is here, but I really love, there's a wonderful book that was published late last year called Living with Cancer, written by all Irish professionals, really leaders in the field, also cancer survivors. Orla Crow, I was at the launch of the book and is a cancer survivor herself, is also a medical social worker, and really in this book speaks to this. By its nature, cancer is an ambiguous, shocking, and frightening life experience. I had no control over the disease that was already inside my body. The only thing I had control over was my response to it. And that is really a succinct way of talking. And that's true actually for a lot of different types of catastrophes or traumas, or if somebody's been in a car accident, or, a lot of times we don't have control over what happens, or in a way how things turn out, but we can control, again, our response to it. And that's where we want to ideally spend our energy and efforts. So I'm going to jump in and just talk. And so this is starting to think about what's on that menu. And my hope is that, my guess is many of you are doing many of these things. And I'm actually kind of speaking to the choir here. You all are here today. You're taking some control. You're engaging. You're seeking community. So these are really wonderful things. So my guess is if we were to do a research study, you all would have kind of better coping than maybe people who would never think to come here. So I want to just acknowledge, my guess is you're doing many good things. My hope is that we might hear something, and it might not be from me, then that's okay today. It might be from Paul or Sonia or one of the other speakers. But that's what we want to do, is broaden what's on our menu of options. In psychology, one of the things we work on is how can we be psychologically flexible? The research coming out about this idea of psychologically flexible. How can we respond in the moment, over time, with our own well-being, has really good outcomes for our quality of life and many other things. And so my hope is that you come away from today, this conference, with several new things that you can add to your own menu. So just in general, I've kind of grouped some different areas here, but around physical stuff, right? Working towards a healthy diet. And the nice thing is there's sessions later today about a lot of these topics to go more in depth. Now that's important. We also do not want people so rigidly worried about every single thing in their diet that it contributes to their fear of cancer recurrence. I always keep in mind that a meeting I went to with a bunch of oncologists years ago, probably 10 years ago now, and these were some of these leading oncologists, they were sitting there drinking a Diet Coke and eating a piece of birthday cake, right? We have to live also. We cannot just be, anything that gets too rigid, we need to pay attention to. So working towards a healthy diet, increasing movement and exercise. And I put some stars on here because I think this is one of the areas that we actually, I say we as in my field in psychology, but I don't think we stress enough how important it is. I love Paul's example, and I know another person was up here talking about walking. That has such benefits for our mental health well-being, our outcomes for when we go into surgeries, for actual cancer recurrence rates. So just getting moving is a really important, and it doesn't mean you have to be at the gym for 6 hours a day. It means getting moving, walking the back garden, taking the steps, parking a little farther away. Adequate sleep, reducing alcohol, minimizing caffeine, and this one's an important one, and I love my tea here. But a lot of times when a new client or patient I'm working with, I'll ask about their caffeine consumption if anxiety is something that they're concerned about. Many people don't realize we can get unaware of how much caffeine we're actually consuming, and that actually contributes to increased experiences of anxiety in our body. And then practicing relaxation physically. And I just want to kind of do a side note here. Around relaxation, there's lots of different options. And deep breathing, this is something I teach every single client I have or patient. I teach all of my students who I teach, every single person. We start with putting our finger, you just put your, I can move to the side a little bit, putting your hand on your diaphragm. We breathe shallowly. And what we want to do is breathe from our diaphragm. And so learning how to truly breathe deeply, I cannot highlight how important it can be. And the nice thing I think about learning true deep breathing, it's portable. We take it anywhere we go. If we have to have a scan or we have to have a difficult conversation with a physician, we take it with us. If we have to, whatever we do, we can take it with us. So again, it's free, it's portable, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to get it at the pharmacy. And so it's such a wonderful thing. And one thing I just want to highlight, and my kids, I have 3 kids, but they all know, anytime they have to do something, we're like, Mom, we know, deep breathe. And I'll be like, what do you have to do? A longer out breath, right? So when we breathe, we want to use our diaphragm. We want to have our belly go out, but to relax, we actually want a longer exhalation. So it's not just breathing. So learning to practice this is really important. So if you take away one thing and do one thing from my talk, look up deep breathing and look up some videos on it tomorrow. And if you spent 3 minutes a day, 30 seconds, just practicing that every day, it's not going to solve things. But when we feel anxious or overwhelmed, I sat before coming up here just because I always try to center myself with some deep breaths. Visualization and imagery can be very helpful. Our mind is incredibly powerful, and the research on how we can use our mind, of how we experiencing pain, how we experience distress, is phenomenal. And we could do a whole session on that, specifically of how we can use our brain to help adjust our experiences. And then progressive muscle relaxation is very useful, can also be very good if people are having sleep issues. So all of these, I don't have time to kind of go through them right now, but just know there's a lot of material available online, on the Irish Cancer Society website, there's books. If you work with a therapist, some of the nurses can also teach a lot of these. But I will highlight, to get benefit, these are things that you have to practice. So managing stress, emotional coping, I'm going to run through these because a lot of these are going to be familiar to you, but seeking support from a variety of other people. You want, ideally, it doesn't have to be a huge group, but you want some variety. Ideally not relying on only one person, but having a few people kind of in your inner circle. Sharing your feelings. A lot of times there's this idea we have to be stoic. We just have to soldier on and get through something. The research doesn't support that. What it does support is kind of realistic expressions of our emotions. And so being able to share feelings of sadness or fear or anger or worry, that actually is beneficial. And a lot of times I will talk with people and they'll think, well, I have to, if I say it, it makes it real. You know what? If it's going on in your head, it's already real, right? So the way that we can be vulnerable, and sometimes it might be even writing it down. If you don't want to share it with somebody, journaling, or maybe you paint, or you do other artistic things. The importance of prioritizing humor, Some people have written recently about finding pocketfuls of joy, these little moments of joy. Silly things, cat videos, right? Or silly jokes, or if there's a comedian you like. Finding or scheduling small things you enjoy each day. I'll often work with patients and we'll come up, because a lot of times when people are feeling overwhelmed or really down in the dumps or depressed, it's hard to think of some of these things. But I've had patients say, I want to paint my fingernails purple. I want to eat biscuits. I want to, call that friend who I've neglected for a while. So finding small things, and it literally scheduling something every day. Getting outside your house or where you live. I always tell my patients, the couch or the sofa is not your friend. That chair is not your friend. It'll suck you in. When you need it, but otherwise you need to be out. Even if it's just sitting outside or, watching the birds or sitting in a park or going, somewhere, really has an incredible benefit. And spending time with pets or children when you can. Managing stress. There's a lot of things we can do psychologically. So some of the things we can do, interestingly enough, is learn about stress. So when we take control, a lot of times when people feel overwhelmed by stress, and the research is pretty clear that one of the ways we can take control is actually learn about what happens physiologically in our bodies when we feel stressed. People often feel like they are going crazy. And so learning, some psychoeducation about learning, why does that happen? What happens? The number one treatment for panic disorder, when people have panic attacks, starts with learning about what's happening in your body, because people fear that they're actually having a heart attack or that they feel like they're going to die. And so taking control by learning physiologically what's happening. This is a natural response to something that's overwhelming. And so same thing with fear of recurrence. Learning about why is this happening, what is happening, makes a difference. I cannot encourage peer support more. And I'm so glad that's a focus here and with the Irish Cancer Society. And Paul just talked about how wonderful having a connection. That image I showed that had an intervention, it doesn't have to come from a physician or a nurse or a psychologist. It can come from another survivor. It can come from your minister or priest. It can come from a person at the shop. All of these people can have an impact. Peer support is such a profound way to connect with people. So really, really helpful. Focusing on things you can change instead of those you can't. Even, I didn't ask Paul this, but he didn't try to change the fact that he was in the hospital. He tried to change what he could do while he was in the hospital. And sometimes keeping it really small and manageable and setting a challenge that is a big challenge for the time, but changing what you can. And there's things that we can't change, right? And we've all had things where we can't change, and then that's when we work on how do we learn acceptance? How do we practice acceptance? How do we practice tolerating we don't know? Scan results won't be back. How do we tolerate that horrible time in between we get results? Staying present and in the moment. Sometimes mindfulness meditation can be helpful. There's other ways to do this that you can learn, but staying present, staying in the moment, not trying to get too far ahead. Being aware of our self-talk. All of us, people are often surprised to hear that we all talk to ourselves in our head. That's normal. It's called self-talk. But that self-talk, if you start paying attention to it, it's fascinating. There's things that we're saying that not so much unconscious, but we're just not aware of. And so those things, this is never going to work out. I can't do this. Nobody will be there for me. Those might be actually happening without you even being aware of it. So bringing some awareness to that self-talk and working on being realistic. Instead of, this isn't going to work out. Geez, this next day is going to be rough, but I hope next month is better. Or, this is going to be a really difficult appointment, and yet I know I can get through this next hour, is more realistic. And considering evidence-based psychotherapy. There are some really good therapies that have been shown over the last 30, 50 years to have good outcomes. So just to put in a plug for psychotherapy when appropriate. Also spiritual coping. And I just have a minute or two left here, so I'll be brief, but managing stress and spiritual coping. This is really beneficial. So, and whatever that means to you, it might mean nature. It might mean services on a Sunday or a Saturday, praying, meditating. It could be reading spiritual or uplifting writings. It could be music. And that could be Diana Ross or religious music or whatever that is for you, and asking support from a faith community. Maybe your parish has opportunities and support. And then for many people, spirituality can also be found in nature. Just in terms of time, I was going to ask for ideas about poor and unhealthy coping, but we all know some of these. We have a lot of unhealthy coping, right? Isolating, avoiding things, starting arguments. There's lots of things that we do. So just briefly, and also doing things that are too excessive. So sometimes we can numb out. And just to say, I'll put this up, I won't speak to this directly, but other people, these are just some of the ways that other survivors, and this was from a research publication, but notice how many different things they did. Building a birdhouse, right? Like, that's not in my presentation, but that might be what coping means for you. Watching birds, fishing, volunteering, right? So, when might you need more support? A lot of times we think about the 2-week rule of thumb. If things are very disrupted or you're suffering for 2 weeks, ideally, you need to reach out. Sleep, you're isolating, kind of ruminating, can't stop thinking about anything but. And the worry is debilitating. Now, again, if there's something urgent, thoughts of self-harm or suicide, ideally you need to reach out immediately and get support. But in general, it's okay to reach out if it's even less than 2 weeks and you're suffering, or you want to learn new skills or be proactive or make changes. I would just encourage you, even before our session is over, on the piece of paper in front of you, even research shows if you write something down, you're more likely to do it. So I would just encourage you, before we leave this room, write down what are 3 new things that maybe you want to do more of, or that you're proud of, or that you'd like to try. And I know you're like, oh, whatever. But the research shows if you write it down, you're more likely to follow through with it. And of course, just a reminder, there is support and help available. Please do reach out. We don't want the suffering in silence. Some good resources. There's a lot of wonderful resources out there. These are just a few. Russ Harris has phenomenal books about coping and adjustment. I use his work constantly. There's a great book about mindfulness, a kindly approach to being with cancer. Living with Cancer is the new book that just came out that is all Irish experts, or experts here in Ireland. And then Between Two Kingdoms. There's also some great podcasts, and the Irish Cancer Society, of course, has amazing resources. So just to say thank you, there's my email if you need to connect or reach out, and then I'm happy to wrap up and just say thank you for being here, and also thank you for letting me be with you. Okay.
Yeah.
You want me that side?
Yeah.
Okay.
Amanda, thanks so much. Really, really interesting. 2 psychologists on the stage. You know what they call it? The group noun for psychologists is often known as a disagreement of psychologists. But we're going to agree a lot, actually. And I suppose that fear of recurrence is the theme. Is something that me as a spouse is something that I do. I heard that often the spouse feels, and I think the individual closer to re-examination and scans. It's something that can sort of wax and wane and stuff like that. And when you talk about where do you feel it, I actually feel it in my body. That's where I feel that stress. It could be in my physically, and then I use exercise as my go-to to sort of mediate that. So
where do you feel it even physically? Just out of curiosity.
So I feel it here.
In your belly.
Gut. Yeah, I feel it in my gut, yeah. So when I think about it, and you think about the impact and the consequences, it sort of hits you there. And then this deep breathing exercise, which is a really powerful tool of going to, is one way of sort of, you can actually visualize it in and then blowing it out as well. And I was very interested in the author that you brought up about the cracks, And sometimes I call that surfing in the grey, that life is about surfing in the grey. We love the certainty is out black and white and but life is like, how do we navigate the grey? And there's a lot of people in the grey in the room in how navigating uncertainty. And that's so I think some really powerful insights. And you've given lots of tools there that people can use straight away. So we're going to take some questions from the room as well. And if you have questions at home, you can send them in and in the chat function. And I'm going to get, in the power of this machine I have in my hand, I'm going to get those questions. Is there any questions that people would like to ask? And my hand is going. Yes, so we've one down here. So we'll get a microphone to you, sir, down there in a moment. Really appreciate if you can think about the questions. I like that whole idea too, writing that 3 things down. That reminds me of that other book, Getting Shit Done. So I hope you got those 3 things down. And sir, we'll bring you into your question.
Hello, thanks very much. And I really enjoyed that presentation, the psychological impact of a cancer diagnosis. I'm not a patient myself. We represent CLL patients, CLL Ireland, and my wife is a CLL patient. That when patients are diagnosed with CLL, they usually don't need treatment, so they're actually just waiting for the disease to get to a level that they need. And even when they get treatment, it's incurable, so now they're waiting for the next treatment. So you can imagine the psychological impact. I suppose I will add, COVID is not mentioned. It's not gone away for our community. Our patient community, about 30% of them don't have an antibody response to vaccination. So when I see the different tools that the patients could use, they're isolating. They can't really use peer support and meet the patients face to face. I would love to have seen maybe politicians here to hear. I'd love to see the Irish Cancer Society maybe address these. I know they address it in a certain way, but it's really, really a rough time for our patients. I know we like to think COVID has gone away. And I just want to know from you, would you have any advice for our CLL community?
Yeah, and just to say thank you for what you do, and also just for your bringing that issue up. I think that's so important. And you're totally right. COVID has not gone away in the slightest. And for many of our most vulnerable people in our communities, it's an ongoing daily thing to be thinking about. So I think you're exactly right. And I think all of this has to be adjusted for individual perspectives. And so again, how do we practice acceptance of kind of some of the conditions and also find ways to take control? So you're exactly right of peer support you might not be able to go meet somebody for a coffee or go to the park, but again, can we ideally, virtual options are available currently. Can we use connection through literature, through art, and can we build up some of our communities? And I think one of the things you said there is really about that, the CLL community as well, that I think we need that validation that we're in this together. It's not one person isolating, it is a community, but I think you're absolutely right of the profound impacts that it has on people. I think also that idea of expressing it, of not sitting on. I'm glad you raised it today, right? That's another way, is that we express the reality of what's happening. The other piece, and it's not in here, but you bring up, is one of the places we can find control and meaning is through advocacy. And so to find purpose and meaning, and how do we advocate for better conditions, better funding, better support is really critical. And so advocacy can happen constantly and can give, I love that Eddie talked about meaning earlier, because that's where we find some of the best quality of life and outcomes for all of us. And so advocacy could be a way as well. I hope that's helpful.
And there's knowledge as well, because where we started out with COVID and where we are now with COVID, we have knowledge. We have a level of, we know by ventilation, by space, by vaccination, by different processes, we can reduce the risk. Quite often they look at that Swiss cheese whole model around risk. But we know more now about that, so we can sort of manage maybe the environment that we do meet people in and stuff like that in an outdoor space. So it's using that knowledge, because we have we've gone down the steps a little bit further than where we were 2.5 years ago. Any other thoughts or questions there? Yes, please do.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. Could I just say, though, as a cancer survivor, the context is really relevant as well, that there's a danger that, this could be heard as our anxiety being neurosis or unnecessary. And I know you weren't meaning that, but sometimes it can feel like the rest of the world is telling us, don't be silly, you're better now, go back to normal, it's all fine. And yet, in the medical context, we are, as patients, as former patients or survivors, asked to monitor. We are asked to engage in surveillance. We are, it is part of the package. We're not the worried well. We've crossed over the line into being people who need to keep an eye out, who do have scans or whatever every, 6 months, every year, those kinds of things. So I think part of the problem is if you don't feel like you can access the medical support or say, here is this symptom, I've monitored it for a while, it's not all in my head, that you can feel unsupported. So you can practice as much mindfulness and resilience and so on as you like, but it does have to take place in the medical context of somebody saying, yeah, I've checked that out and that one's okay, or we do need to look at this one, or So I just feel like we shouldn't end up burdening the survivor as the person who has to deal with this alone. It takes place in the context of the medical team as well. And that's why wellness clinics work so well, where somebody could say, could I talk to somebody about this pain in my arm? Is it just old age, or could it be, is it related to cancer? Rather than leaving us to kind of soldier on for a year until our next checkup.
I completely agree with everything you said there, completely, 100%, and thank you for sharing that. I absolutely agree. I think you're exactly right. We need early intervention, and whatever that intervention is, spending 5 minutes to have somebody do a quick check of something dispels everything. And so I will often work with people about being advocates for getting what they need at that time. And I always think if it's going to disrupt your sleep for a night, we need to change something and get you access somehow. And ideally, we're setting up systems that allow for that. And that's why I love these survivorship clinics or these opportunities, because somebody should not be waiting a year if they have an ongoing concern. And you're exactly right in part of I don't want to saddle survivors with more, and also, I was going to say something I forgot.
If I could,
yes, go ahead.
Sorry, you got
it.
it.
No.
The worried well, this label of the worried well, it bothers me, right? It must bother you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
absolutely.
it's a sort of a
dismissive.
It's a throwaway, dismissive term. It's non-validating, because really what a person is experiencing is distress. You're saying that you're in a different phase and you're experiencing levels of distress, but it's not acknowledged in a way. And the systems then around, what are the systems in place to try and support individuals with the psychological impact of their cancer experience? So I think this worried well, it's actually, it's totally dismissive. It's sort of saying that people don't require a service almost.
Yeah.
I actually think it's such a throwaway phrase.
Yeah, and I think just in general, and I think also I agree with you, and I think speaking to also your comment about, we want to acknowledge that there's going to be increases of worry and anxiety, and that's acknowledging it, and how do we support people at each stage of that? Because we are asking people to do surveillance, we're asking people to come for scans, and that's worry about those things is a natural experience. And so how do we support people for going through that with as little distress as possible, I think is critical. And whatever that means for somebody, and you're totally right. I have a great quote that I use where it's, we can't yoga ourselves out of this. We can't meditate ourselves out of this. So those can be things, useful tools, but it's not going to resolve. And sometimes we need other things. So I think as we need to be paying attention of not minimizing people's experience and also helping people proactively look, what do I need? Sometimes I might need peer support. Sometimes I might need a 5-minute appointment with a nurse to clarify something.
And just a shout out to the Irish Cancer Society support services that are there as well, with very experienced nurses. Other questions there? Yeah, super, thank you. We'll just take it up here, in this table here. Thanks a lot.
Amanda, that was an amazing talk. Thank you very much. But I'd like to say too that from my perspective, when you're in cancer, you're preoccupied with being in cancer. When you do come out the other end, and thank God for us, we got good news, you are left in limbo, but your mental health needs to be a priority as well as having those, is there something wrong with me, but your mental health. And for me, I kind of feel like, where do I go with this? And yes, the Irish Cancer Society is there, and the absolutely wonderful organisation. But I feel, which I know I shouldn't, a burden, because I'm so aware that the service is under pressure with people who are in it. Whereas that side of it, you don't want to be selfish, but you're still in it. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm not crazy?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm going to wrap. So you're definitely not crazy, and there's not. It's really. But the Irish Cancer Society, I have no doubt, would say we're there for you. Nobody is a burden. That's the nature of the service. It's an open service, and it wants to support individuals. And listen, I want to thank Amanda, our speaker, for this session. We're going to wrap up now. Some really interesting questions. We're going to go into another session in it shortly. There's a little stretch break. You can check out our exhibitors out there and the sponsors, and we thank them very much, all of them, and we'll name them later on. But I want to you can check out the stalls. I want to thank Amanda, so we'll have a boulabos for Amanda, don't forget, all the way from Chicago. And we thank you very much. And there's no health without mental health. And so thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay.